way back, deep in the night of time, there had been an earlier civilization, one that wasn't recognized in mainstream history and archaeology at all, and that it had passed down an influence all around the world, which explained the many common factors that we find in many different cultures all around the world, and that what had happened to this civilization was a cataclysm. Some tremendous disaster had overtaken the earth, and as I homed in more and more on the research, it became obvious. The time frame became obvious. This was somewhere around 12,500 years ago. And I knew that was the end of the Ice Age, and that there had been cataclysmic events at the end of the Ice Age. But I think one of the problems with Fingerprints of the Gods was that I couldn't absolutely, backed up by hard science, I could not absolutely put my finger on precisely what that cataclysm was. I speculated, I explored, particularly the intriguing theory of Earth crust displacement of Charles Hapgood, which was, subsequently refined and developed greatly by Rand and Rose Flemath. And this was an important influence on my work in Fingerprints of the Gods. But the problem with that was that there's no mainstream scientific backing for it at all. And so people were left wondering, particularly those of a skeptical frame of mind, were left wondering, well, Hancock's saying there's been this cataclysm, but what was it really? We don't see science recognizing a big cataclysm 12,500 years ago. And that's one of the very new things with Magicians of the Gods, is that we now have the absolute rock-solid science on what that cataclysm was and how it was connected to the end of the Ice Age.
Oh, and when we get into it, it's going to shake a lot of people. It really will. Now, when this civilization was obliterated, are these the Atlanteans that we hear so much about, or some other civilization?
No, I think that the Atlantis story that's been passed down to us by Plato, in fact, he's the oldest source we presently have of the Atlantis story, is indeed an account of this lost civilization. And the reason that there are many reasons I think that, but one of the most intriguing is that Plato actually gives us a date for the submergence of Atlantis, for its destruction in a single terrible day and night that left mankind to begin again like children, with no memory of what went before. And that date is 9,000 years before the time of Solon. And Solon was the Greek lawmaker. He was an ancestor of Plato, and he had visited Egypt around 600 BC. And there he had been told by the priests of a temple in the Delta the story of Atlantis. And they told him that Atlantis had gone down 9,000 years before their time. So since that time was 600 BC, we're talking 9,600 BC, in other words, 11,600 years ago. And that turns out to be one of two dates. The other one was 12,800 years ago, when cataclysmic events indeed unfolded upon this planet. And the event of 11,600 years ago was accompanied by a gigantic, rapid, sudden sea level rise that is referred to as meltwater pulse 1b. In other words, extensive global flooding. And that's exactly what Plato talked about. So the accusation that Plato made Atlantis up has to be set at rest now, when we realize that he gave the date that science and geology in the 21st century has only recently homed in on.
Isn't that incredible?
The date of a cataclysmic event. It is truly incredible, and I think it brings Plato's Atlantis story out of the shadows, and it should come back into center stage. This is one of the precious accounts we have of a forgotten episode in human history.
How advanced was this civilization, Graham, before the tragedy occurred?
My sense is, first of all, that it was a very different civilization from our own. This was a civilization, I think, that explored and developed the faculties of the human mind. You might even refer to them as psi faculties. Our culture has gone down a particular route of development, which is to do with mechanical advantage. We make machines. We make technology. We extend our limited physical powers with machinery. We extend our brain power with machinery in computers, for example, my sense from studying this material many years is that the lost civilization we're looking at was much more interested in the powers of the human mind, and those powers have become latent. They've fallen into disrepair in our society today. People still have them, but they're not exercising them. They're not engaged. The truck, if you like, is not in gear. And I think the power of the human mind, the ability to manipulate matter directly with the human mind, telekinesis, telepathy, all such issues. There's many hints that this is the character of the civilization we're looking at. When it comes to technology, what I can say pretty much for sure is that a level of technology had been achieved more than 12,000 years ago, which was at least equivalent to the level of technology that we had on planet Earth at the beginning of the 19th century or in the late 18th century.
Truly amazing. Truly amazing.
That's my thought. And this was a civilization that explored and mapped the world during the Ice Age. And as I reported, indeed, in Fingerprints of the Gods, some of those maps have come down to us.
I have always thought that we had an advanced civilization, Graham, whether it was ET related or just by evolution, that got to the moon. And, that some of the artifacts that may be on the moon were left behind by these ancient people who literally had the ability to travel in space.
Well, that's an intriguing possibility, and I don't completely rule that out by any means. And indeed, looking at our immediate cosmic environment, you may recall I wrote a book called The Mars Mystery back in the 1990s,
exactly.
which looks at the anomalies on Mars. There do seem to be some objects, some artifacts on nearby planetary bodies, including the moon, which certainly look artificial. Can I say man-made? I don't know. We need to investigate this more. At the moment, we only have photographs. We need much more. We need much more than that. But new information is coming in all the time, and I think we have to keep an open mind.
Now, back to the ancient civilization. Might they have been ET related in terms of technology and help? Well,
let me make clear that I am not an advocate of the ancient astronaut theory.
Okay.
And that's for a number of reasons. Firstly, I need to be absolutely clear that I have nothing against the idea of ancient astronauts or of alien intervention in human affairs. We won't talk about this at length tonight, but I have had experience of contact with intelligences, with non-human intelligences. But those experiences have been achieved by altering my state of consciousness, using the South American visionary brew called Ayahuasca. And I have had classic ET contact experiences in that state. And I think that one of the things that we need to do to investigate this mystery further, just as we investigate the physical aspects of the alien abduction phenomenon, we should also be deeply investigating its implications for consciousness and the possibility that by changing our state of consciousness, we may contact and communicate with non-human intelligences. I think that's worthy of real deep research. That being said, having spent quarter of a century traveling the most intriguing, the most beautiful, exciting, and mysterious ancient archaeological sites in the world, really walking the walk, investigating and exploring these sites, not just reading about them, but being there with my feet on the ground, sometimes for months, the conclusion I've come to is that I have not seen anything in any of these mysterious ancient sites that I could only explain with a culture that had the technology to cross interstellar space. What I see is evidence of incredible advancement way beyond the period of time. At a time when human beings are supposed to have just been hunter-gatherers, we see evidence of huge advancement and great technical skill and knowledge. But I am of the opinion, I'm not going to completely rule the alien aspect out, but I am of the opinion that what we are dealing with is a lost, advanced human civilization, and that it much more brilliantly explains the anomalies that are raised by the ancient astronaut lobby than the notion of ancient astronauts themselves. In other words, I think that these ancient and mysterious sites around the world are very poor evidence for the ancient astronaut hypothesis. I don't think they serve it well. when you really investigate those sites, the notion that aliens were involved in building them doesn't make sense. For example, the Great Pyramid is an incredibly precise and accurate monument, 6 million tons, 13-acre footprint, and it's just 3/60ths of a single degree off true north. But hey, if you can cross interstellar space and navigate all the way to this pale blue dot, and you're involved in some way in building the pyramid, you are going to get it dead on true north. Not 3/60ths of a degree off. So that looks like human error to me, but it looks like the human error of a very advanced culture.
And they may have used sound resonance to move those blocks. Who knows what they did?
I think you're onto a really important point there. I think sound was one of the techniques they used. And again, there are many traditions. I go into this in Magicians of the Gods. There are many traditions of sound being used to levitate large blocks of stone, which, of course, our archaeologists dismiss as simple fantasy. I think we should be listening to those accounts.
And I would guess, Graham, that this advanced civilization probably had no foreknowledge of their doom.
I don't think so. It's a complicated story, George, because we're actually talking about an episode that lasted for 1,200 years. The cataclysm began 12,800 years ago, but there was a second episode of cataclysm 11,600 years ago. So before the first episode, I don't think they knew. But in the period between the first and the second episode, there were still survivors of that civilization, and I think they then knew what they were dealing with, and I think they set about a conscious project to preserve their knowledge and to pass it down to the future, just as we would do if our civilization faced total destruction. We would want not everything to be lost. We'd want to pass something down, and I think that's what happened.
Graham, were these calamities related to each other, even though there was a span of 1,200 years?
Yes, the same object caused them both. They are absolutely related to each other, very closely related to each other.
Now, 20 years ago, of course, with Fingerprints of the Gods, time has buzzed by. Mm-hmm. Has anything been new? Has any new discoveries been created?
George, there's just been incredible new discoveries. First of all, and we'll go into this no doubt in the next segment, but first of all, we have the absolute hard scientific evidence of an extinction-level event that occurred 12,800 years ago and repeated itself 11,600 years ago. And then we have the emergence of incredible archaeological sites like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, which is 11,600 years old, spot on exactly that date. A gigantic megalithic site, 50 times larger than Stonehenge in England and 7,000 years older than Stonehenge. There is no precedent. There is no background to Göbekli Tepe. It just comes out of nowhere. And then after they'd made it, the people who made it deliberately buried it and hid it away like a time capsule, untouched for more than 10,000 years until it was rediscovered and excavated in the second half of the 1990s.
Amazing. Graham,
so that's one of many sites. There's another site in Indonesia called Gunung Padang, a pyramid that may go back more than 20,000 years. New evidence is just coming out of the woodwork all the time, and the old paradigm of history, the old model of history, cannot explain that evidence. Is
science starting to back some of this up?
Yes, it is definitely being backed up by science. Now that we know that an extinction-level event occurred in that window between 12,800 and 11,600 years ago, many hard scientists are saying this must have had implications for history. The only people who are ignoring it so far are the archaeologists. I don't want to blame them completely. This is new information. It's only begun to filter out into the public domain since 2007, and perhaps that's, not enough time for archaeologists to incorporate it into their models of the origin of civilization. But they need to get on with it, otherwise they're going to be left behind in the rush of change of ideas.
Is it difficult for them to basically come down to earth and agree to these kinds of possibilities?
Yes, I think it's very difficult. Like any strongly held belief, and archaeologists do have a strongly held belief that their view of the past is correct, we tend to identify our strongly held beliefs with our own persons, with our very being. So an attack on those beliefs can be easily construed as an attack on us as individuals, as people. And when we're attacked as individuals and people, the natural reaction is to become very defensive, to become very territorial, to circle the wagons and drive off the intruder. And that's how archaeology behaves towards this new information at the moment. I think they feel very threatened. I think they feel psychologically threatened at the level of individuals by this information.
We're going to come back and talk about the calamities, two huge calamities that changed this planet. And welcome back to Coast. Graham Hancock with us, his new book, Magicians of the Gods. Graham, these two calamities, these catastrophes that occurred between 12,800 and 11,600 BC. What happened?
12,800 years ago and 11,600 years ago. So that's 10,800 BC to 9,600 BC. What happened was the Earth was hit by fragments of a giant comet. This is very new science, but it's not often understood that comets can go up to 200 miles in diameter. There's a vast population of comets in an area in the outer solar system called the Oort cloud. There's more than 1 trillion comets in there. And as the solar system goes in orbit around the center of the galaxy, at the center of our Milky Way galaxy is a humongous black hole out of which all our reality at some point in the past poured. And we are in orbit around that black hole. It's a colossal orbit that takes hundreds of millions of years to complete. And during that orbit, the solar system and the Earth amongst it doesn't simply orbit in the plane of the galaxy, but it kind of dives up and down through the plane of the galaxy, a bit like a porpoise or a dolphin swimming through the sea. And every time it crosses the plane of the galaxy, gravitational disturbances are unleashed upon the Oort cloud and the Kuiper belt, the two main sources of comets. And they can send comets from those very distant, very safe orbits flying in towards the inner solar system, where they can be captured by the sun and can go into orbits that cross the orbit of the Earth. A lot of people think that comets are just dirty snowballs, but that is not the case. Comets are huge chunks of rock bound together by ice. And what happens with comets is that they have a tendency to break up into multiple lethal fragments. I think all of us can remember 1994 and the spectacular firework display put on by comet Shoemaker-Levy 9 when it broke into 20 fragments.
Into Jupiter they went.
And pounded into the giant planet Jupiter. Now, this was not a very big comet. This was a comet only 2 kilometers in diameter. It broke into 20 pieces, but those 20 pieces, each one of those explosions on the surface of Jupiter, had more power than all the nuclear weapons on Earth being exploded at once. If those objects had hit the Earth, we would have been in real trouble in 1994. But they did not, because our Earth is protected by the planet Jupiter. The planet Jupiter is the giant guardian of our planet. As a matter of fact, there would be no life on Earth if it wasn't for the protective role played by Jupiter.
Is because of Jupiter's size, Graham, it just sucks it in with its gravity?
Yeah. Gigantic gravity, massive gravity. And it's circling out there like a watchman in the outer solar system, and it just grabs the comets that are coming into the inner solar system, and it pulverizes them. It's big enough.
Thank God.
It can take it. So I wake up every day and say, thank you, Jupiter.